January 12, 2003. In a Miami hospital room, Maurice Gibb, the man who had stood between his brothers for 4 decades, the musical anchor who had held the Bee Gees together through triumph and turmoil, took his final breath at 53. He died not from the excesses that had threatened him in darker years, but from a twisted intestine that doctors discovered too late to save him. The harmony's architect, mistaken by history for background noise, was gone. His death was as sudden and unexpected as a song cutting off mid-note, leaving the world to wonder what had just been silenced. Within hours of the announcement, Barry Gibb, the eldest brother, the voice everyone recognized, released a statement that cut through decades of public perception. The Bee Gees are finished. Without Maurice, there are no Bee Gees. It was an acknowledgement that came too late for Maurice to hear, a recognition that the man who had spent his life in the shadows between 2 spotlights had actually been the light that made both of them visible. Maurice wasn't just 1/3 of a legendary group. He was the translator who turned Barry's melodies and Robin's harmonies into actual music. The diplomat who prevented fraternal warfare from destroying their partnership. The foundation upon which a musical empire had been built. The world mourned a Bee Gee, but few truly understood what had been lost. He was the bass that held the bottom, the keyboards that filled the space, the voice that harmonized both brothers into something greater than either could be alone. Sometimes it's easier to hide behind the bass, Maurice had once confessed during one of his rare moments of vulnerability, and in that simple statement lay the tragedy of his existence. He had chosen to be invisible, to be the glue rather than the showpiece, to sacrifice recognition for harmony. And the world had accepted his sacrifice so completely that even in death, most obituaries led with Bee Gees member dies, rather than recognizing that the member who had died was the one who had made membership in the Bee Gees possible. What if the real tragedy wasn't that Maurice died young, but that he lived his entire life in a space between spaces, always the middle child, always the mediator, always the one who held things together at the cost of his own visibility? What if the man who said he never cared about being the star had actually needed to be seen, to be recognized, to be understood as more than just the guy in the middle, but to understand how Maurice Gibb became the invisible anchor of one of music's greatest acts? We must first understand how a gentle boy from the Isle of Man learned that love sometimes means making yourself small so others can shine, and how that early lesson would both create a legend and destroy the man who enabled it. The year was 1949, and in Douglas, Isle of Man, fraternal twins were born into a household already shaped by music and ambition. Maurice and Robin Gibb entered the world as a pair, but from the very beginning there were differences that would define their entire lives. Robin emerged first, 17 minutes before Maurice, establishing a hierarchy that would persist for decades. Robin was the serious one, the intense one, while Maurice, even as an infant, was described by their mother Barbara as the gentle one, the easy baby, who never wanted to cause trouble. The Gibb household was one where music was not just entertainment, but destiny. Their father, Hugh, was a band leader who understood that talent could be both gift and commodity, a man who saw in his sons the potential for something extraordinary. When elder brother Barry showed an early aptitude for singing and guitar, Hugh recognized the makings of something special. But it was Maurice, the middle child between Barry and his twin Robin, who would become the musical foundation that made their father's dreams possible. From early childhood, Maurice displayed a gift that went beyond simply performing. He could play anything. While Barry focused on guitar and vocals and Robin developed his distinctive vibrato, Maurice taught himself bass, keyboards, guitar, and eventually any instrument he could get his hands on. It wasn't showing off, it was service. Even as a young boy, Maurice seemed to understand that his role was to make the others sound better, to fill in whatever gaps existed in their musical arrangements. The dynamics between the three brothers were established early and would persist throughout their careers. Barry was the natural leader, confident and charismatic, the one who would front the group and whose face would become its public image. Robin was the artist, temperamental and intense, whose unusual voice would become one of the Bee Gees' most distinctive features, and Maurice was the glue. Maurice, the one who played whatever instrument was needed, who smoothed over conflicts, who made sure rehearsals happened and equipment worked and egos didn't destroy what they were building together. Could these early patterns, Maurice as the facilitator, the enabler, the invisible support, have planted seeds for both his later indispensability and his struggles with identity? Even as a child, he seemed to understand that being loved meant being useful, that his value came not from shining himself but from making others shine brighter. The Isle of Man was a small stage for such big dreams, and the Gibb family knew it. Music was their ticket out, and Maurice was learning that his ticket would always be standing in the middle, holding his brothers together. The family's move to Australia in 1958 marked the beginning of the Bee Gees as a professional entity, but it also cemented Maurice's role as the brother in the middle, literally standing between Barry and Robin during performances, metaphorically mediating between their increasingly different approaches to music and life. Australia in the late 1950s was hungry for entertainment, and the Gibb brothers arrived with the perfect combination of talent, ambition, and desperation to succeed. They performed anywhere that would have them: shopping centers, racetracks, television studios, building a reputation as a polished teen act with something special. The Australian years saw them achieve local fame, but it was Maurice's musicianship that gave them versatility beyond typical boy bands of the era. While other groups relied on backing musicians, the Bee Gees could create a full sound with just the three of them because Maurice could switch between instruments as needed. He was the secret weapon that nobody talked about. The reason they could sound like a complete band even when it was just three brothers on stage. But success in Australia wasn't enough. The world beckoned, and in 1967, the Gibb brothers made the fateful decision to return to England to pursue international stardom. They arrived with little more than their instruments, their songs, and an unshakable belief that they had something the world needed to hear. What they didn't know was that this journey would transform them from local celebrities into global superstars, and that Maurice would pay the highest price for that transformation. By the time they returned to England in 1967 to pursue international success, the pattern was set. Barry would write the melodies and sing lead on most tracks. Robin would provide the distinctive harmonies that made their sound unique, and Maurice would do everything else: play bass, keyboards, guitar, sing harmonies where needed, arrange parts, and most importantly, keep Barry and Robin from killing each other when creative tensions threatened to tear the group apart. The late 1960s belonged to the Bee Gees in a way few could have predicted. Their Baroque pop sound captured something in the air of the time, a sophisticated emotionality that stood apart from both the British invasion's raw energy and psychedelia's experimental excess. Songs like "To Love Somebody" down Massachusetts, "I Started a Joke," and "Words" weren't just hits, they were emotional landscapes that millions of people found themselves living in. The world was falling in love with the Bee Gees, and the Bee Gees were learning what it meant to be loved by the world. But while Barry's songwriting and Robin's vocals received critical acclaim, Maurice's contributions were typically summarized in reviews as solid or professional, the kind of praise that acknowledges competence while erasing artistry. He was playing more instruments, contributing more to arrangements, doing more of the work that transformed Barry's melodies into finished productions. But it was Barry's face and Robin's voice that defined the Bee Gees to the public. Maurice was becoming essential and invisible in equal measure. I never cared about being the star. I cared about the music, Maurice would claim in interviews, but those who knew him well understood this was only partial truth. He did care about the music deeply and genuinely, but he also cared about being recognized, about being seen as more than just a supporting player. The problem was that he cared even more about keeping his brothers together, about maintaining the family bond that had become their professional identity. And in that hierarchy of caring, his own needs always came last. The question that would haunt Maurice throughout his life was already forming during these early years of fame. Who was he when he wasn't being the middle brother? What was Maurice Gibb's identity when separated from the Bee Gees? The answer he was beginning to fear was that there might not be a Maurice Gibb without Barry and Robin, that he had become so thoroughly the glue that he had lost any sense of himself as a separate entity. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? For Maurice, that question would take decades to answer, and the answer would nearly destroy him. The first major crisis came in 1969 when Robin, feeling overshadowed by Barry and underappreciated by the group, quit the Bee Gees to pursue a solo career. For Maurice, this wasn't just a professional setback. It was a personal trauma that struck at the core of his identity. He had spent his entire life being a twin, being part of a unit, and suddenly half of that unit was gone. More troubling still, Robin's departure was partly about visibility, about wanting to be recognized as an individual artist rather than just one-third of a group. It was everything Maurice felt but had never allowed himself to express. The rift between Barry and Robin put Maurice in an impossible position, literally caught between his twin and his eldest brother, expected to choose sides in a conflict where both sides had legitimate grievances. True to form, Maurice chose harmony over honesty, continuing to work with Barry while also maintaining contact with Robin, trying to be the bridge that might eventually bring them back together. The emotional toll of this mediation, of always putting others' needs before his own, was beginning to manifest in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. I was the referee. Without me, the match would have ended long before, Maurice would later reflect. And there was pride in that statement, but also profound exhaustion. Being the referee meant never getting to play the game yourself, always watching from a position of necessary neutrality, never allowing yourself to have needs or desires that might disrupt the fragile peace you were maintaining. He was the guy in the middle, and the middle was becoming a very lonely place to stand. The reconciliation of the Bee Gees in 1970 should have been Maurice's triumph. He had held the center, maintained the relationships, and brought his brothers back together. But instead of feeling validated, he felt even more trapped in his role as mediator. The group's subsequent creative slump and commercial decline in the early 1970s only intensified the pressure. They were together again, but they weren't succeeding, and Maurice couldn't help but wonder if his sacrifice, his abandonment of any solo ambitions to keep the group intact, had been for nothing. Behind all that early success, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The question was becoming increasingly relevant as Maurice navigated the strange terrain of being famous yet invisible, essential yet unrecognized, constantly surrounded by people yet feeling fundamentally alone. His marriage to Lulu, the Scottish pop star, should have provided some anchor of identity outside the group. But even that relationship was complicated by their mutual fame and the pressures of maintaining public images while their private selves were struggling. It was during this period of professional uncertainty and personal crisis that Maurice first turned to alcohol as more than just social drinking. The bottle offered what music couldn't anymore, a way to quiet the voice in his head that asked why he was always the one who had to compromise, always the one who had to be reasonable, always the one whose feelings came last. Sometimes it's easier to hide behind the bass, he had said, and now he was learning it was even easier to hide behind a drink. The transformation came in 1975, not through any action of Maurice's own, but through the vision of producer R.F. Martin, who heard something in the Bee Gees that the world had stopped listening for. The ability to reinvent themselves completely, the decision to embrace R&B and disco, to shift from balladeers to dance floor dominators was risky and radical. But it was also, perhaps unknowingly, the moment when Maurice's particular skills would become not just useful but essential. The new sound required precise, pulsing bass lines that could drive dancers while supporting Barry's increasingly falsetto vocals. It needed layered keyboards that could create atmosphere while filling the space where traditional string arrangements might have been. It demanded a rhythmic foundation that was simultaneously tight enough for the beat and loose enough for the groove. Everything the Bee Gees needed for their reinvention was exactly what Maurice had been developing in obscurity for years. And suddenly being the guy in the middle was the most important position in popular music. Saturday Night Fever in 1977 didn't just resurrect the Bee Gees' career. It made them the biggest group in the world, writing and performing songs that would define an entire era. Stayin' Alive, How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever, More Than a Woman. Each track was a masterclass in how to make people move, and at the foundation of every one was Maurice's bass and keyboards, creating the bedrock upon which Barry's melodies and Robin's harmonies could soar. For the first time in his career, Maurice's role was not just acknowledged but celebrated by musicians and producers who understood what he was doing. Session players and arrangers recognized him as one of the most sophisticated bass players in pop music, someone who understood that the bottom wasn't just about holding rhythm, but about creating emotional space and harmonic color. The keyboards he layered into tracks weren't mere decoration but essential architecture, building the sonic environments where the songs lived. Picture this: a massive arena, tens of thousands of fans screaming, the Bee Gees at the absolute peak of their disco dominance. The opening bass line of Stayin' Alive begins, that iconic hypnotic pulse that would become one of the most recognizable riffs in music history. Maurice stands there, hunched over his bass, fingers dancing across the strings with mechanical precision, creating the heartbeat that drives the entire song. The crowd erupts, but they're screaming, "Barry! Barry!" Some shout for Robin. Maurice keeps playing, keeps the rhythm locked in, keeps everything together. The spotlight sweeps past him, pauses on Barry in his white suit, moves to catch Robin's profile. Maurice remains in shadow, the guy in the middle doing what he always did, making the magic possible while remaining invisible. But even as his musical contributions became undeniable, Maurice remained invisible to the broader public. When photographers captured the Bee Gees at the height of their disco dominance, Barry's face was always front and center, the handsome eldest brother who sang the leads. Robin was the interesting one, the artistic brother with the unusual voice, and Maurice was just there, literally in the middle, figuratively in the background, essential but unseen. Behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The pressure of maintaining that level of success while remaining unrecognized began to take its toll in ways that success itself made easier to hide. There was money now for private struggles, fame enough to command privacy, and an entourage willing to protect the group's image even as Maurice's drinking escalated from problematic to dangerous. The bottles that had started as escape were becoming prison, and the man who had spent his life holding others together was coming apart himself. The late 1970s were simultaneously Maurice's professional peak and personal nadir. He was playing on records that would sell tens of millions of copies, performing for audiences of thousands, living the rock star life that seemed like the fulfillment of every musician's dream. But success had not brought the recognition he had unconsciously been seeking his entire life. He was still the other one, still the twin, still the guy in the middle. And the more successful the Bee Gees became, the more invisible Maurice felt. The irony was devastating. The very qualities that made him indispensable, his ability to support others, his willingness to put the group first, his talent for making everything work without drawing attention to himself, were the same qualities that ensured he would never receive the individual recognition his brothers enjoyed. He had become a victim of his own competence, too good at being the foundation to ever be allowed to be the edifice. The 1980s arrived with a vicious backlash against disco that hit the Bee Gees with particular force. Disco Demolition Night at Comiskey Park in 1979 had been more than just a publicity stunt. It was a cultural rejection that felt personal. Records were burned, the Bee Gees became a punchline, and the same music that had made them the biggest act in the world was now something people were ashamed to admit they'd loved. For Maurice, watching the music he had helped create become a joke was almost unbearable. When you've sacrificed your individual identity to be part of something larger, and that larger thing suddenly becomes a target of mockery, what do you have left? Did this tragic backlash mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems that had been festering for years? The question had no good answer, and Maurice stopped looking for one in anything except the bottom of a bottle. His alcoholism during this period was both symptom and cause, symptom of the deeper identity crisis that had been building his entire life, and cause of the personal and professional disasters that would define his darkest years. His marriage to Lulu had already failed, a casualty of two careers and two egos that couldn't coexist peacefully. Now his second marriage to Yvonne was straining under the weight of his drinking and the depression that fueled it. Maurice was spiraling, and everyone could see it except Maurice himself. Or perhaps he could see it perfectly well. He just didn't care anymore. Sometimes it's easier to hide behind the bus, and sometimes it's easier to hide behind oblivion. The tabloids, which had largely ignored Maurice during his successful years, suddenly found him interesting in his decline. The Forgotten BG became a recurring headline, articles that purported to express concern while actually reveling in his struggles. The coverage was simultaneously sympathetic and savage, painting him as a tragic figure while implicitly blaming him for his own situation. The message was clear. Success had been the group's doing, but failure was his fault alone. What the tabloids didn't understand, what Maurice himself sometimes struggled to articulate, was that his drinking wasn't simply a response to the Bee Gees' commercial decline. It was the culmination of decades of sublimating his own needs, of always being the one who compromised, of building his entire identity around being useful to others rather than being himself. When the music that had justified all that sacrifice was no longer valued, Maurice had nothing left to hold on to except the numbness that alcohol provided. There were nights when he would sit alone in his home studio, surrounded by all the instruments he had mastered, and wonder who he was without them. The bass guitars that had defined countless hits hung on the wall like artifacts from someone else's life. The keyboards that had created atmospheres for millions of dancers sat silent, covered in dust. Maurice would pour another drink and think about how strange it was to be essential to something that no longer existed, to be the foundation of an empire that had crumbled. The lowest point came in the late 1980s when Maurice's drinking nearly killed him. There were emergency room visits that were hushed up, interventions that failed, promises that were broken as soon as they were made. His family watched helplessly as the man who had always held them together came undone. Barry and Robin, who had depended on Maurice their entire lives, suddenly found themselves in the unfamiliar position of having to be the strong ones, to be the mediators, to be the glue. It was a role reversal that none of them knew how to navigate. The family confrontation that finally forced Maurice into rehabilitation in 1991 was both a crisis and a revelation. His brothers, his wife, his children, they all gathered to tell him that they loved him but couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore. It was the moment when Maurice, for the first time in his life, had to choose between being useful to others and saving himself. The choice was agonizing because it meant confronting the fundamental question he had been avoiding his entire life. Who was Maurice Gibb when he wasn't being the middle brother, the mediator, the musical foundation that held everything together? Rehabilitation was neither quick nor easy. Maurice had spent his entire life running from himself, hiding first behind the bass, then behind the bottle. Now he was being asked to stand still, to look at himself directly, to figure out who he was without all the elaborate defenses he had constructed. The process was terrifying because what if the answer was nothing? What if, when you stripped away the music and the mediating and the self-sacrifice, there was no Maurice Gibb at all? Just an empty space where a person should have been. But slowly, painfully, Maurice began to discover that there was someone there after all. Not the star he had secretly wanted to be, not the individual artist he had sacrificed to keep the group together, but something perhaps more valuable. A man who could support others without destroying himself. Who could be useful without being invisible. Who could stand in the middle not because he had to, but because he chose to. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Maurice, the question became whether he could build a new identity that incorporated his role as anchor without being consumed by it. The answer emerged slowly through the 1990s as the Bee Gees experienced a creative renaissance that was partly due to Maurice's sobriety. Clean and focused, he brought to their music not just technical proficiency but genuine joy, rediscovering the pleasure in creation that had been drowned in alcohol. The 1990s saw a remarkable resurgence for the Bee Gees. They weren't chasing trends anymore, weren't trying to recapture the disco glory or compete with whatever was dominating the charts. Instead, they were making the music they wanted to make. Music that reflected their maturity and experience. Music that acknowledged both their history and their evolution. Albums like Size Isn't Everything and Still Waters showed a group that had nothing left to prove but everything left to say. Maurice's contributions during this period were marked by a newfound confidence. He wasn't hiding behind the bass anymore. He was commanding it, using it as a tool of expression rather than a shield. His keyboard work became more adventurous, his harmonies more prominent. For the first time, he seemed comfortable being visible, or at least comfortable with the particular kind of visibility that came with being Maurice Gibb. Not the star, but the foundation that made the stars possible. But even sobriety couldn't entirely resolve the fundamental tension in Maurice's existence. He was still the guy in the middle, still the one whose contributions were essential but underappreciated, still living in the shadow of Barry's leadership and Robin's artistry. The difference was that now he had learned to find satisfaction in that role, to accept that his legacy would be measured not by individual fame but by the collective achievement he had made possible. There was a peace in that acceptance, a kind of wisdom that comes from finally understanding your place in the world. Maurice had spent so many years fighting against his role, resenting it, drowning it in alcohol. Now he was learning to embrace it, to see that being the anchor wasn't a curse but a calling. Someone had to hold things together. Someone had to stand in the middle and refuse to let the people they loved tear each other apart. That someone was Maurice, and maybe that was enough. Without music, I don't know who I am, Maurice had once said. And perhaps he had finally made peace with that truth. The music was enough. Being part of something larger was enough. Making Barry and Robin sound better was enough. Or at least he had convinced himself it was enough, which for a man who had spent his life convincing himself to accept less than he deserved, might have been the closest thing to peace he would ever find. The final years of Maurice Gibb's life were marked by a quiet contentment that had eluded him during his struggling years. He had found stability in sobriety, peace in his marriage to Yvonne, and a renewed creative partnership with his brothers that produced some of their finest later work. The Bee Gees of the late 1990s and early 2000s weren't chasing trends or trying to recapture past glories. They were simply making the music they wanted to make, and Maurice's contributions had never been more assured or essential. The recognition he had sought his entire life was finally beginning to come, though it arrived in forms he hadn't expected. Younger musicians, particularly bassists and producers, spoke of Maurice with reverence, citing his work as foundational to their own understanding of how rhythm and harmony could interact. Music historians were beginning to reassess the Bee Gees' legacy, and many were noting that Maurice's contributions had been systematically undervalued in earlier accounts. But perhaps more importantly, Maurice himself seemed to have found a measure of peace with his role. He had learned through recovery and maturity that being essential didn't require being visible, that you could be the anchor without drowning under the weight of what you were holding up. He spoke in interviews about being the glue, and there was no longer pain in the acknowledgement, just a kind of quiet pride in having done something that mattered, even if it meant remaining in the shadows. There were plans for the future. The Bee Gees were discussing new albums, possible tours, projects that would take them into the new millennium with grace and dignity. Maurice was excited about these prospects in a way he hadn't been in years. He had finally figured out how to be Maurice Gibb, not Barry's brother, not Robin's twin, not just the guy in the middle, but himself, complete and at peace. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? Maurice had made different choices than his brothers, choosing harmony over individual glory, choosing to be essential rather than visible, choosing to be the foundation rather than the edifice. Whether those choices were brave or tragic, wise or self-destructive, is perhaps impossible to say. What's certain is that without those choices, the Bee Gees would never have existed, at least not as the phenomenon that sold hundreds of millions of records and defined multiple eras of popular music. The irony was that this hard-won contentment made his sudden death in 2003 even more tragic. At 53, Maurice had finally figured out how to live with the paradox of his existence, how to be simultaneously essential and invisible, how to support others without losing himself entirely, how to find meaning in being the guy in the middle. And then, without warning, his body betrayed him in a way that had nothing to do with the alcoholism he had conquered or the depression he had fought. January 12, 2003. The day began like any other. Maurice woke up feeling unwell, complaining of stomach pain that seemed routine at first. Yvonne suggested he see a doctor, but Maurice, true to form, didn't want to make a fuss. The pain worsened throughout the day until it became unbearable, and finally, reluctantly, Maurice agreed to go to the hospital. By the time they arrived at Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami Beach, his condition was critical. The doctors discovered a twisted intestine, a volvulus, that had cut off blood flow to vital organs. They rushed him into emergency surgery, but the damage was too extensive. Maurice never regained consciousness. For a man who had spent his entire life holding things together, being literally torn apart from the inside seemed almost cruelly poetic. The twisted intestine was a medical accident, the kind of random tragedy that reminds us how fragile life is regardless of how carefully we construct it. But in the hours and days that followed, as the news spread across the world, it became clear that what had been torn apart wasn't just Maurice's body. It was the entire fabric of the Bee Gees. Barry's immediate declaration that the Bee Gees are finished wasn't just grief-talking, it was the recognition of a fundamental truth. Without Maurice, there was no center, no anchor, no glue holding everything together. Robin might continue to perform under the name, but everyone understood that something essential had been severed, that the unique chemistry that had made the Bee Gees more than just three talented brothers had died with Maurice. The funeral brought together musicians from across generations and genres, many of whom had never publicly acknowledged their debt to Maurice's musicianship. Bassists spoke of studying his lines, learning how he could make a simple four-note pattern carry an entire song. Producers discussed his arrangements, the way he understood that leaving space was sometimes more important than filling it. Multi-instrumentalists expressed admiration for his versatility, his ability to switch between instruments and still maintain the emotional core of a song. But perhaps the most telling tributes came from his brothers, who seemed unable to articulate the full scope of what had been lost. Barry, in particular, struggled to explain what Maurice had meant to the group. How do you describe someone who was never the star but was always the reason the stars could shine? How do you explain that the person everyone overlooked was actually the person making everything possible? He was the guy in the middle, Barry finally said, his voice breaking. And we never realized that the middle was the only place that mattered. Was Maurice's death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? In this case, the powerful forces were perfectly visible. They were the dynamics of family, the economics of fame that rewards frontmen over support players, the cultural tendency to celebrate visibility over essence, and perhaps most significantly, Maurice's own choices to prioritize collective success over individual recognition. His death from a twisted intestine was a medical accident, random and cruel. But the life that preceded it had been shaped by forces both chosen and imposed, by decisions both conscious and unconscious, by a pattern established in childhood and never quite broken. There were questions, of course. Some pointed to the years of alcohol abuse, wondering if the damage to his organs had made him more susceptible to medical complications. Others noted that Maurice had been complaining of stomach problems for some time but had characteristically downplayed them, not wanting to burden anyone with his issues. The guy in the middle refusing to make a fuss even when his own life was at stake. But conspiracy theories never gained much traction in Maurice's case, perhaps because his story was already tragic enough without needing embellishment. There was no mystery to solve, no hidden villain to unmask. Maurice Gibb died because sometimes bodies fail, because medicine can't always save us, because life is fragile and arbitrary and cruel. The only mystery was how someone so essential could have remained so unseen for so long. The obituaries struggled to capture who Maurice had been, falling back on familiar phrases: the quiet one, the middle brother, the musical anchor, that were all true but somehow insufficient. How do you summarize a life spent making others shine? How do you celebrate someone whose greatest achievement was enabling achievements that would be credited to others? The language of celebrity, of individual accomplishment, of personal triumph, didn't quite fit someone whose purpose had been to make the collective greater than any individual could be. In the weeks and months following Maurice's death, musicians and critics began to reassess the Bee Gees' catalog with new ears, listening specifically for Maurice's contributions. What they discovered was revelatory. Bass lines and keyboard parts so perfectly integrated into the song's fabric that they had been invisible despite being essential. His work was the definition of great support musicianship, so well done that it didn't draw attention to itself, so perfectly suited to the songs that it seemed inevitable rather than invented. They found Maurice in the opening bars of Stayin' Alive, that iconic bass line that had driven a generation onto dance floors. They found him in the keyboard atmospherics of How Deep Is Your Love, creating emotional space for Barry's falsetto to soar. They found him in the tight rhythmic pocket of Night Fever, the foundation that made everything else possible. He was everywhere and nowhere, essential and invisible. The note you don't hear but can't live without. The reassessment extended beyond just his musical contributions. People began to understand the role Maurice had played as mediator, as peacekeeper, as the diplomat who had kept the Bee Gees together through decades of creative tension and fraternal conflict. Without Maurice, Barry and Robin might have had solo careers, might have had success, might have had fame. But they never would have had the Bee Gees, never would have created the magic that came from their particular combination of talents and personalities. Barry himself seemed to undergo a transformation in the years after Maurice's death. He spoke more openly about his brother's contributions, more honestly about how much he had relied on Maurice, more sadly about the recognition that came too late. "I always knew Maurice was important," Barry said in one interview, "but I didn't realize he was irreplaceable. I thought we needed him for the music, but it turned out we needed him for everything. He was the silence that made the harmony possible." Robin, too, struggled with Maurice's absence. The twin, who had been the first to break away, to seek individual recognition, now found himself haunted by the space where Maurice had been. He continued to perform as the Bee Gees, refusing to let the name die, but everyone, including Robin, knew it was a fiction. The Bee Gees had been three brothers, but more fundamentally, they had been a specific alchemy that couldn't be recreated once one element was removed. Robin would die himself in 2012, and with him went the last remnant of that original magic. Maurice Gibb's legacy is a complicated thing to measure. He never had a #1 hit as a solo artist. He never won awards that specifically honored his individual contributions. His name doesn't appear in most lists of greatest bassists or keyboardists, despite his clear influence on both instruments. By conventional measures of musical success, the ones that prioritize visibility and individual achievement, Maurice might seem like a footnote to his brothers' careers. But to truly understand Maurice's legacy, we need to expand our definition of what it means to be great. He proved that you don't need to be the star to be irreplaceable, that the person holding everything together might be more important than any of the people in the spotlight. He showed that selflessness and talent aren't mutually exclusive, that you can be extraordinarily gifted and still choose to use that gift in service of something larger than yourself. In the years since his death, Maurice has become something of a patron saint for support musicians, for the bassists and drummers and keyboardists who make the magic happen without getting the glory. His story resonates because it's the story of so many talented people who choose, or are forced to choose, between individual recognition and collective achievement. How many Maurice Gibbs are out there right now holding bands together, making stars possible, sacrificing their own visibility so others can shine? And perhaps that's the question we should all ask ourselves. In celebrating the visible, the vocal, the frontmen and women of any enterprise, how often do we forget to recognize the anchors who make their success possible? Maurice Gibb spent his life being essential without being celebrated, holding things together without expecting credit, making magic without demanding recognition. "Sometimes it's easier to hide behind the bass," he once said, and he hid there for his entire life. But the world only realized too late that the bass was holding everything together. He proved that you can be the foundation, the anchor, the glue, and still matter, perhaps matter most of all. He showed us that the guy in the middle isn't just filling space between the stars. He's the force that keeps the stars from flying apart. Maurice Gibb was the invisible architect of the Bee Gees, and in his invisibility he built something that will last forever. The question remains, will we learn to see and celebrate the Maurice Gibbs of the world before they're gone? Or will we always realize too late that the anchor was the only thing keeping us from drifting away? In a culture obsessed with individual stardom, with being #1, with standing out from the crowd, Maurice's life asks us to reconsider what we value. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand in the middle and refuse to let the people you love tear each other apart. Sometimes the most important thing you can be is the note that nobody hears but everybody needs. Maurice Gibb died having finally made peace with being the anchor, the foundation, the guy in the middle. But his death revealed what he might not have fully believed himself. That anchors are what make sailing possible. That foundations are what make buildings stand. That the guy in the middle is often the only reason there's anything to hold together at all. He was the harmony's architect, mistaken by history for background noise. But listen closely to any Bee Gees song and you'll hear him there, holding everything together, making the impossible possible, proving that invisibility can be its own kind of power, until invisibility erased him. And so we return to that hospital room in Miami, January 12, 2003, where Maurice Gibb took his final breath. The guy in the middle was gone, and suddenly the middle collapsed. Barry and Robin tried to continue, tried to pretend that the Bee Gees could exist without their anchor, but everyone knew the truth that Barry had spoken in his grief. Without Maurice, there are no Bee Gees. Perhaps Maurice's greatest achievement wasn't any single song or performance, but rather the way he redefined what it means to be great. In a world that measures success by visibility, by individual achievement, by stepping into the spotlight, Maurice proved that sometimes the highest calling is to step back into shadow so others can shine. He showed us that the person nobody sees might be the person everyone needs. He demonstrated that hiding behind the bass, really truly hiding there your entire life, might be the bravest thing you can do as long as you're holding the song together. The Bee Gees sold over 220 million records. They defined multiple eras of popular music. They created songs that billions of people have danced to, cried to, fallen in love to. And none of it would have been possible without the man who chose to be invisible, who chose to be the foundation, who chose to stand in the middle and hold everything together even when it cost him everything. Maurice Gibb's life asks us a question that we still haven't answered. How many invisible architects are we failing to see right now? How many people are holding our world together while we celebrate the people standing in front of them? And will we ever learn to value the anchors before they're gone? Or will we always realize too late that they were the only reason we didn't drift away? Sometimes it's easier to hide behind the bass. Maurice Gibb hid there his entire life, and the world only realized too late that the bass was playing the most important part of all.